Hey guys, tonight we're starting slow. Maybe grab your tea, maybe not. Dim the lights, let whatever's on your mind fade out for a bit. Because we're heading way back. Really back, before kings, before empires, before people started pretending taxes were noble. Tonight's story is about cats. Yes, those little creatures who now dominate your sofa and your camera roll. But once upon a time, humanity didn't tease so much on cats, as cats just sort of tolerated us. And somehow, because history loves a repeat performance, we went and domesticated them not once, but twice. Because of course we did. So, let's drift back to the beginning. Picture it 10,000 years ago, the end of the last ice age. Things were thawing, slowly. Humans were also thawing, turning from roaming hunter-gatherers into early farmers, staring wistfully at their new piles of grain and thinking, wow, this is progress. But progress, as usual, came with problems. Specifically, rats. Everywhere. Now, these weren't your cute cartoon rats wearing aprons and singing while they cook. No, these were grom-thieving opportunists. Sleek little highways of fur running through the early villages. And, as is so often the case, nature had already built the perfect counter-argument to rats, wildcats, not domestic cats just lean, solitary desert hunters who happened to find these new human settlements full of free lunch. The first stars of this story come from the Near East modern day. Turkey, Syria, Israel, Egypt. Scientists like to call them Felis Silvestris Libica, but you can think of them as the ancestors of your judgmental house cat. They were probably lounging around ancient granaries, pretending they didn't care about the humans a few feet away, while quietly making the rodent population disappear. The humans noticed. Cats noticed. A kind of unspoken deal formed. We got fewer wheat munchers, and they got a supply of juicy snacks and a warm roof to sleep under if they felt like it. Nobody signed anything. It was more of a shrugging mutual tolerance. You could say cats domesticated themselves. And, honestly, that tracks. Because humans have done this for millennia, deciding who gets to be domestic. But cats make the rules. They chose us when it suited them. And to this day they could leave. But they don't. Not really. Let's pause there for a second. Early farmers are out there hauling water, planting seeds, building walls out of mud bricks. And over in the corner, a sleek tubby-shaped shadow is dozing in the sun, occasionally twitching its tail in a very self-satisfied way. That's the beginning of the world's longest and most passive-aggressive friendship. Now, evidence for this first domestication shows up around 9,500 years ago on the island of Cyprus. Archaeologists found a burial site, one human, one cat, laid out together, side by side, as if someone thought, yeah, you can go together. Nobody knows their names, or if that cat was beloved, or just accidentally too slow to escape the afterlife invitation. But it's the earliest sign that people were already feeling sentimental about their feline neighbors. And we know Cyprus didn't have native wildcats, which means someone, somewhere, carried one or several cats overseas on a boat. That's right. Our ancestors risked sea travel to bring along a moody carnivore that probably ignored them the whole way. Priorities. From there, cats and humans spread out together. Throughout the ancient Near East, cats slinked through granaries, nesting by food stores, quietly shaping our early civilizations. Egypt, in particular, looked at this freeloading predator and said, actually, she's divine now. Because, of course, Egypt did. Around 4,000 years ago, cats were already icons along the Nile. They protected households from vermin, and somewhere between functional pest control and pure aesthetic adoration, Egyptians began turning cats into symbols of grace, fertility, and feminine energy. Enter Bastet, the cat-headed goddess who embodied both domestic comfort and ferocity. If you look at Egyptian art, Bastet starts out more lion-like, broad, protective, fierce. But over time she evolves into a sleek domestic cat, lounged gracefully at her owner's feet, still watching everything, but with that inscrutable, mildly judging face we all recognize. People adored her. And by extension, they adored actual cats, too. Mummified cats cat amulets, cat statues, entire necropolises filled with feline remains. It's estimated that millions of cats were mummified during Egypt's later dynastic periods. That's a lot of linen. And even more reverence. But let's keep this slow. Imagine walking into an Egyptian temple late in the day, slipping low, incense hanging thick in the air. Somewhere in the shadows, a cat's eyes catch the last light. You'd think of this, you'd offer food, or a bow, or a quiet prayer. Because in Egypt, cats weren't just pets. They were part of cosmic order itself, and woe to anyone who hurt one. Ancient sources like Herodotus, who never met an exaggeration, he didn't love, claimed that if a person accidentally killed a cat, even by mistake, angry mobs might handle justice right there in the street. Whether or not that's true, it paints a vivid picture of just how far humans had gone from grain protection deal to divine protector of the home. At this point, you might think, okay, so cats are Egyptian, but the story doesn't end there. In fact, feline fascination turned them into global exports. Traders, soldiers, travelers, many of them took cats along for the ride. Wherever ships docked, a few slinky passengers disembarked, exploring new lands with their slapdash human companions. By around 1000 BCE, cats had reached Greece, later Rome. And of course, like nearly everything the Romans touched, cats soon became infrastructure. Roman camps had cats patrolling granaries and ships, keeping provisions safe. They also became domestic mascots, lounging on Roman mosaics like minor celebrities. And yet, in all this, cats never quite became like dogs. Dogs worked for humans, herded, guarded, fetched things. Cats, they existed near humans, doing their own thing. They didn't need training or approval, just a steady supply of rodents and mild appreciation. Historians sometimes call them semi-domesticated, which basically means they agreed to move in, but they're not signing a lease. Let's float over, now, to a second time humanity repeated itself, when another group of people, halfway around the world, went through nearly the same process. Because while Egyptian cats were purring through the old world on the opposite side of Asia, something remarkably similar was happening. In China, around 5,000 years ago, early farmers along the Yellow River were busy building their own settlements, growing millet, storing grains, attracting, yes, rodents. And into this came another species. The leopard cat, smaller than a leopard, larger than your average house cat, and with a certain perpetually annoyed expression. The leopard cat became Asia's answer to rodent problems. Genetic evidence shows that early Chinese farmers and leopard cats entered into their own low-effort alliance, mirroring the one between Near Eastern farmers and the African wildcat. So basically, humans domesticated cats twice, once with Felis silvestris libica in the Fertile Crescent, and independently again with Priona luris bengalensis in East Asia. Two entirely different wild species, both deciding we were kind of okay roommates. That second domestication didn't quite last, though. Leopard cats eventually got replaced by imported Near Eastern cat sour. Modern domestic catsuan trade expanded, but for a while there were two parallel cat-human relationships, evolving independently, both born out of grain, pests, and begrudging coexistence. It's oddly poetic. Two civilizations, thousands of miles apart, making the same accidental discovery that the best way to make life easier, isn't always with spears or technology at us, by feeding something that purrs and maybe making it feel like it's still in charge. All right, we're still drifting tonight. The candles are low. Your tea's probably gone lukewarm. And somewhere in the distance, your cat's just knocked something off the counter. Typical. When we left off, humans had already made peace with their feline freeloaders, first in the Near East, 10 in China. Cats had become minor deities in Egypt, casual acquaintances in Greece, and part-time employees for the Romans. But civilizations fall, crumble, turn to dust, and cats, of course, stay, because cats are evolutionary freeloaders of chaos. They thrive no matter who's in charge. So let's slide quietly from the warm sands of Egypt to the chilly, stone-built corners of medieval Europe. This is where the story gets weird. When the Roman Empire collapsed, their roads cracked and their aqueducts dried up. But cats didn't get the memo. They continued wandering ports, villages, farmhouses anywhere. A rat dared to nibble at food stores. Sailors took them aboard ships, and cats being, well, cats spread across every coastline. Roman soldiers had once carried them north into Britannia, and the Vikings carried them even farther. Archaeologists found the remains of cats aboard Viking ships well fed and groomed, which is impressive considering how Vikings treated most things. They seem to have had a soft spot for felines. Vikings liked practical animals, and a creature that could handle rats without supervision. A dream. Imagine the longships of the North Sea. Crew of bearded warriors, sea spray, the thrum of oars, and in the corner a tabby, blinking slowly, utterly unimpressed by the conquest happening around her. That's history's truest picture of balance. From Scandinavia to Scotland, cats settled in monasteries, farms, and trading towns. In some early Irish texts, monks even wrote about them with a kind of sleepy affection. The 9th century poem Pangur Bán is an ode by a scholar comparing his work to his cat's nightly hunt. He writes about himself writing and Pangur hunting mice, both equally engrossed in their arts. Two roommates, minding their own business. It is one of the rare moments medieval literature drops its armor and just talks about quiet companionship. But then came Christianity's grand reshaping of Europe, and with it, suspicion. Pagan Egypt had called cats sacred. Medieval Europe called them something else. There's a grim irony there. The same sleek, beautiful animal once seen as divine protector slowly started to represent witchcraft, sin, and the devil's favorite +1. Early Christian texts often described cats, especially black ones, as cunning, deceitful, and aligned with evil spirits. Because, heaven forbid, an animal that hunts at night just likes the dark. The Church, in its fascinating urge to demonize whatever wasn't easily explained, began linking cats, especially those owned by women, with witches. Women living alone with a cat. Clearly sorcery, because what else could explain female independence and small mammals sharing a roof? By the 13th century, papal decrees started appearing that condemned heretical sects supposedly worshipping demonic cat figures. Cats were burned, beaten, expelled. Superstition thrived, while cats didn't. And here's where the story gets that darkly funny twist humanity specializes in. Because almost immediately after this anti-cat hysteria spread, another thing did too: the Black Death. Rats, as it turns out, don't care about theology. They carried fleas, infected with Yersinia, the plague bacterium that would go on to kill a third of Europe's population in the 14th century. And since the Church had just wiped out a significant number of felines, the natural hunters have said rats, the rodent population, was basically throwing a non-stop party. So yes, humans persecuted cats for allegedly being in league with the devil, and the following decades saw the worst rodent-borne pandemic in recorded history. There's karma, and then there's medieval-level irony. Now, historians debate how much the cat massacres actually contributed to the plague-s spread. Not entirely straightforward, but you can't ignore the timing. Cats weren't the villains of this story. They were the unpaid janitors Europe sorely missed. Still, they survived. They always do. Some hid in barns or ports, living among sailors and traders who were too pragmatically minded to indulge in superstition. Merchant ships in particular couldn't go without them. Every ship's hold was a buffet for rats, and one pregnant cat could fix that quickly, which is how cats quietly repopulated coastal towns, slipping back into Europe's good graces, one per at a time. By the late Middle Ages, cats were creeping back into art and daily life. Paintings began showing them among household scenes, curled near fireplaces, or watching over mothers and children. There was even a grudging shift among theologians, who decided maybe not all cats were demonic. Just some of them. That's progress, in medieval terms. And so, while peasants whispered superstition, artists and poets quietly fell back in love with cats' eerie beauty. They became symbolic, sometimes of domesticity, sometimes of sensuality, sometimes of both. And of course, in myth and medieval imagination, they remained mercurial, too smart, too independent, too untrustworthy. But honestly, that's what saved them. Cats never needed our approval the way dogs did. They didn't beg, didn't defend castles, and didn't pull carts. Their survival strategy was subtler. They stayed mysterious, necessary, and most importantly quietly effective. By the 15th century, cats were back at sea again, this time on the great exploratory voyages of Spain and Portugal. It's hard to imagine the Nina, Pinta, or Santa Maria setting sail without a few whiskered crew members. Just think. Cats crossing the Atlantic centuries before most of Europe had even heard of the Americas. They were the real explorers, padding around ship decks, balancing effortlessly as sailors stumbled. You can almost picture them watching the horizon with that zen confidence only cats have. Tails flicking, moods unreadable. Wherever humanity went next, cuts went too. The Caribbean, Africa, India, and finally, the new colonies. And by then, the mutual deal was fully sealed. Humans fed cats, and cats, in their aloof way, allowed humans to believe they mattered. Let's slow down a little here. Imagine a medieval farmhouse at night, rain beating softly on thatched roofs, the hearth slowly dimming. A family settles into sleep, and somewhere above the rafters, the soft pad of paws, the sound of one final squeak, and stillness. That's the real heart of domestication. Not ritual. Not ritual. Just quiet coexistence. Perhaps that's why cats never fully fell into the human narrative the way horses or dogs did. They aren't symbols of loyalty or power. They are eternally themselves. And in a world constantly remaking itself through chaos and conquest, that independence is oddly comforting. Welcome back. Let's stay in that quiet space for a bit. The rain's gone. Maybe it's just the low hum of evening now. We're somewhere around the 15th or 16th century, and cats are padding their way into a new world, again a world of glass windows, books, and powdered wigs, still years away from inventing vacuum cleaners. The medieval suspicion is starting to fade, though not disappear completely. People are thinking differently. Now let's heaven and hell more curiosity and invention, and somewhere between all that Renaissance genius, cats land smack in the middle of human imagination again. Because apparently, even when we're discovering perspective and anatomy, we still need something fuzzy sitting on our manuscripts. In Florence, Leonardo da Vinci was busy sketching everything machines, bones, rivers, human faces, and, yes, cats. His notebooks are filled with them. He must have been deeply amused by them, or at least fascinated enough to draw them in 20 different poses. Stretching, twisting, fighting, sleeping, existing in perpetual Not that Da Vinci would. Vieg kept one as a pet. He was too busy philosophizing about the soul, but you get the sense he understood their strange, self-contained perfection. Elsewhere, cats show up in art as both saints and sinners. Venetian painters adored them, especially in domestic scenes. You'd see a house cat curled at the foot of the Virgin Mary, symbolizing comfort and domestic virtue. Then, in other paintings, the same creature becomes a wink to lust, or mischief-slinking. Beneath a couple S-bed in some allegorical Dante, looked a close moment. People, cold and tea, decide if cats were holy or horny, which feels entirely on brand. The duality stuck, which is in folklore, were still said to keep cats as familiars, little extensions of their will. But at the same time, noble women began keeping them as pets again. Small, quiet, graceful, and expensive, they matched the decor. Renaissance portraiture often includes a lap cat somewhere near a lady's jeweled sleeves, staring disdainfully at the viewer, as if knowing this entire painting session is beneath its dignity. You can almost hear it purring judgment. By the 17th century, Europe was relearning affection. Cats were slowly promoted from pest control to emotional comfort animal without actually doing anything to earn that change. They just stayed soft and mysterious, and humans did the emotional labor for them. Let's float gently north for a moment to the Netherlands. Dutch painters in the Golden Age adored depicting daily life, and their canvases are crawling with cats, not as main subjects, but as background philosophers lurking in domestic corners, licking paws or about to steal something from the table. They were part of the home's rhythm, a little chaos built into all that Protestant domestic order. Meanwhile, across the Channel, cats in England were waging an image battle. To the Puritans, they were too pagan, too feminine, too unnecessary. But common folk didn't care much about that. Market cats, barn cats, sailors' cats, they all just existed, unimpressed by theology as ever. One 17th century proverb went, "A cat may look at a king," meaning even the powerless can stare down authority. There's perhaps no truer description of feline energy ever written. And if you look at the periods, literacy, Samuel Pepys scribbling in his diary, or the poets of Restoration London, you can occasionally catch small mentions of cats. Nothing poetic or grand, just quiet observations. The cat by the fire, the cat underfoot. By then, they were fixtures of domestic life again. But cats weren't done moving. These were the ages of exploration and trade. So wherever ships went, India, the Americas, Japan, cats went too. The world was their litter box now, and they used it liberally. Ports became feline melting pots. You could find Egyptian-descended Mausers mingled with hardy northern breeds, all adapting to climates and people as if they owned them. In the East, they'd already been there for centuries. Japan, for instance, had received cats as diplomatic gifts from Tang China as early as the 6th or 7th century. The noble classes treasured them. In Heian era Japan, they even appear in diaries kept by court ladies' elegant little companions lounging on pillows. In one 10th century entry, a noblewoman writes that the emperor's cat was so beloved it had its own court rank and servants, which sounds excessive until you remember this is the same place that gave the world cat. Some traditions age beautifully. By the Edo period, Japanese artists began painting cats as house spirits and bringers of good fortune. The famous beckoning cat, mannequin, likely evolved from those beliefs raised in welcome, a smile just bordering smug. Meanwhile, over in Europe, cats were still fighting for good PR. Victorian England would eventually become obsessed with them. But in these early modern days, cats were still straddling that line between superstition and sentiment. They had work to do, catch mice in taverns, barns, and shipyards, but they were also edging closer to full domestic luxury. You could say the Industrial Revolution of affection was just beginning. So there's the Renaissance and early modern world, a time of thinkers, explorers, and contradictory emotions, with cats curling comfortably in all of it. They just hung back, surviving wars, plagues, revolutions, and fashion trends without breaking a sweater, indeed, showing visible effort. And maybe that's their real secret. Dogs helped humans build civilizations. Horses carried armies. Cats quietly supervised. They've always had that 1 foot in and 1 foot out of our story companions, not servants, which is probably why, after 6,000 years of living side by side, they still haven't learned to fetch. Let's drift forward again, softly now, into the 18th and 19th centuries. Parlor cats, Parisian artists, and the dawn of pet culture where cats stop being helpful creatures and start becoming All right, settle back in. The modern world is starting to hum outside steam engines, gas lamps, industrial everything. But here, in our dim little room of storytelling, nothing has changed. Somewhere, a cat still sits exactly where it wants to sit, quietly shedding onto human furniture without remorse. We're in the 18th and 19th centuries now. The world is spinning faster. But cats, as usual, don't care. They've officially graduated from pest control to emotional companions, and though they still work on ships and farms, they're also sneaking into parlors, curling up beside pianofortes, and being whispered to by sentimental Victorians who have a lot of feelings and absolutely no way to process them. So, let's start with that. Era's emotional explosion. The Victorians. They loved a good pet. Dogs, of course, were already symbols of loyalty and companionate virtue. But cats were something else. They offered quiet they were easy to keep indoors, and perfectly matched the middle-class aesthetic of calm domestic gentility. Queen Victoria herself owned several cats and spoke fondly of them. Once the monarch sets a trend, The rest of the country follows like clockwork. And suddenly, cats became fashionable again. Magazines ran little essays on proper feline care. Cats started to appear at pet shows. Very dignified crowds gathered to admire them, as if ranking which furball looked most disdainful. It was all very formal until, you remember, that most cats being judged probably spent the previous night wandering the alleys behind bakeries. But perception is everything, and the Victorians were masters of it. The era also gave us one of history's strangest, sweetest figures. Louis Wain, the man who painted cats into stardom. You might have seen his work wide-eyed, almost hallucinatory cats wearing clothes, playing cards, drinking tea, participating in that surreal, upper-middle-class, dreamscape Victorian society loved so much. Louis Wain genuinely adored cats. He began sketching them to comfort his sick wife, who found cheer in their household cat, Peter. Those small drawings became a sensation, printed on postcards and calendars everywhere. For a while, Wain turned cats into national icons. They were no longer mysterious or demonic. They were charming, dapper, and slightly absurd. Ironically, that blend of humor and affection probably saved the Victorian cat from sliding back into stigma. Wain's paintings made cats relatable, if slyly manic, and that's how felines went from background household creatures to personal companions in modern life, while polite society was still figuring out whether to define them as pets or independent tenants. The lower classes were living with cats more practically. Every dockside tavern, city workshop and bakery had its own mouser. They were beloved in a rough way. Nobody wrote songs about them, but if you hurt one, you'd probably get scolded. And in the literary world, cats quietly prowled through pages. Edgar Allan Poe wrote The Black Cat, a story that probably didn't do their image many favors, but at least it showed that cats had truly entered the Gothic imagination. Charles Dickens, on the other hand, adored his cats. His favorite, a white kitten named Bob, used to snuff out his writing candles by accident or maybe on purpose, and Dickens supposedly fitted the cat's paw with a tiny letter opener after it passed away, a gesture both tender and gently deranged, which describes Victorian sentimentality perfectly. By the end of the 19th century, Europe and America were completely sold on cats. Newspapers ran jokes about them. Postcards featured them in human clothes. Pet food companies emerged, promising to make feline life as luxurious as any landlord's. And once again, humanity looked around at this animal, shrugged, and said, "Yes, let's worship them again, but more politely this time. Let's float gently now to cats abroad, because while the Victorians were painting and parading them, the rest of the world was also reshaping feline destiny." In Japan, cats had already been icons for centuries, but now they became household charms. The mankineko, with its beckoning paw, showed up outside shops, half superstition, half advertising. China had its own feline lore, leaning more toward quiet guardianship and luck. In America, though, it was a different story. Early settlers brought cats across the Atlantic, mainly as mousers. Not companions, but by the 1800s, America became the perfect playground for domestic cats. Wide-open homes, sprawling porches, and plenty of new pest problems. Cats thrived. They multiplied, blended breeds, and blurred the line between wild and tame in that peculiarly American way. Writers loved them too. Mark Twain, famously grumpy about most of humanity, adored cats unconditionally. He wrote about them in heartfelt essays, calling them unimprovable, which, coming from Twain, was high praise. Even the most hard-bitten cynics of the century couldn't resist projecting personality onto cats. They were individualistic, mysterious, charmingly self-absorbed, a bit like the artists describing them. And as the 20th century loomed, cats were poised to win the definitive battle of modern affection. You could say that by the time electricity lit cities and phonographs filled parlors with music, cats had achieved what no other domestic species fully managed: complete integration without total dependence. They were omnipresent, yet still impossible to control. If you picture a Victorian sitting room, you can probably hear the ticking of the clock, the low murmur of conversation, the faint clink of a teacup, and then, somewhere in the background, the gentle scratch of claws against upholstery. No shouting, no scolding, just resigned acceptance. Because at some point, humans stopped trying to train cats and started letting them be, which might be the only relationship we've ever truly gotten right. Settle in again. We've drifted through millennia of sand, superstition, and society, and we're now in the glow of electric light. The world hums differently here. It's the 20th century modernity in full swingin' somehow. Cats are still here, sitting on windowsills, sleeping on typewriters, ruining generals' uniforms. They've seen plagues, pyramids, popes, and poets, and not one of those things has changed their personality. Let us start with the early decade Z. 1900s through the wars when human chaos reached industrial levels, and cats, once again, provided reluctant, emotional support. During World War I, cats were practically enlisted. Soldiers kept them in trenches to catch rats. Yes, but also just to exist. Letters and photos from the front often show cats curled in helmets or napping inside ration boxers. They didn't care about sides or flags, which was probably wise. War breeds mascots, and cats filled that role effortlessly. Low maintenance, endlessly photogenic, blissfully unaware of logistics. British, German, American, all the same. Wherever men went into mud and fear, some tiny feline inevitably wandered through, slept in someone's lap, and reminded everyone that normal life existed somewhere. World War II took it even further. Navy ships carried cats, just as they had since ancient times. The HMS Amethyst had one named Simon who became a war hero. Simon survived bomb blasts on the ship, recovered, and went right back to hunting rats and boosting crew morale. When he died, he was buried with full naval honors. Only a cat could earn military distinction for pest control and naps. Meanwhile, on the home front, cats were propaganda tools. Posters showed sleek, well-fed cats reminding citizens to keep vermin numbers down for food preservation. Somewhere between morale and marketing, cats became national icons of resilience. And of course, once the wars ended, soldiers brought them home souvenir cats from ports and battlefields, quietly globalizing the species even further. Now, let's drift into the middle of the century, postwar.com. New suburbs, television flickering in living rooms. The age of media had arrived, and cats adapted instantly. They were made for the camera, even if their cooperation levels were non-existent. Early cartoons loved them. Felix the cat, born in the silent film era, was one of Hollywood's first global icons. Simple black shape, wide grin, unpredictable behavior, he pretty much set the visual code for cartoon felines. Then came Tom from Tom and Jerry. Eternally outsmarted, eternally overreacting. Animation studios realized something fundamental. Cats make perfect characters because they already act like caricatures of pride and chaos. Cinema and literature caught on too. T.S. Eliot wrote Old Possum's Book of Practical Cats, a collection of poems so charmingly absurd that decades later it morphed into the musical Cats, a production that proves humanity's endless desire to make art about things that couldn't care less. By the late 20th century, cats were no longer working animals or decorative luxuries, they were household Apartment culture thrived, and cats fit perfectly into it. They didn't need walks, they didn't bark at neighbors, and they offered semi-affectionate companionship with minimal emotional commitment. In other words, they were the perfect pets for a weary, urbanizing generation. Scientists even started studying them properly. Genetics, behavior, body language, and in typically human fashion, every discovery boiled down to the same revelation. Cats do what they want, and we project meaning onto it. Let's glide, now, into the quieter corners of the century writer's studies. Artists' lofts, small kitchens with coffee and cigarette smoke curling up beside sleeping tabbies. Ernest Hemingway had cats at his Key West home. Dozens of Tim many, with extra toes. They still live there today, free-ranging descendants with polydactyl paws and an unbothered sense of literary inheritance. Colette in Paris wrote entire essays about cats as reflections of independence and identity. Tennessee Williams gave them stage presence. Cats were muses again, wrapped in fur instead of myth. And, unsurprisingly, they adapted to fame better than any other animal. The invention of photography made them amateur supermodels. Thousands of amateur snapshots, postcards, and films flooded culture. There is something eternally funny about watching an entire species consistently refuse to perform on Q4 camera lenses. Then came the late-century television, VHS tapes, the first flickers of home computers, and somewhere in all that digital noise, cats found their natural platform. The internet, of course. But we'll get there in a second. Before the memes, though, there was the modern household revolution: pet stores, cat toys, canned food oil, the trimmings of consumer affection. Vets began writing about feline psychology. Publishers released books with titles like Understanding Your Cat, which is ironic since nobody has ever. Feline ownership became less about utility and more about companionship. By the 1980s, they had overtaken dogs as America's most popular pet. How did they pull that off? Style. Mostly. Cats fit modern life perfectly. Compact, clean, visually pleasing, and emotionally detached in a way that modern humans found oddly relatable. People built entire personal identities around them. The cat person became a cultural archetype. Quiet, bookish, slightly mysterious, allegedly introverted, and if popular sitcoms are to be believed, always surrounded by shelves and sarcasm. And then, the internet. The early 2000s arrived, and suddenly the world was divided into broadband connections, LORCELUCN, webcams, and endless content. Cats didn't adapt. They simply existed, and the internet bent around them. They became memes before memes were even called that. Think of it: grainy gifs of cats falling off counters, YouTube classics like Keyboard Cat and Nyan Cat, images of grumpy expressions, loafed-up fur, judging eyes. They ruled with absolute indifference. The internet's humor, its loop of irony and affection, found its spirit animal, and it purred. The truth is, cats always represented what people online secretly wished to be: unbothered, self-sufficient, detached, but adored. They became the unofficial mascots of digital ironies. Cool, they didn't try. So indifferent, they accidentally went viral. Today, cats are everywhere again. In videos, advertisements, plush toys, calendars. There's no royal cult anymore. No temple in Bubastis. But every algorithm bows quietly to them. And maybe, just maybe, humanity's 6,000-year experiment in half-domestication has reached its natural resting point, sharing cloaked, judgmental glances through smartphone screens. Somewhere in all this, the circle closes. The wildcat that crept into an early farmer's granary now lounges on climate-controlled couches. The species never changed, much just the furniture around it, and there's something soothing about that. We've built cities, toppled empires, traveled to space, yet everything still feels the same on some quiet evening when you look over and see those half-closed eyes, that slow flick of a tail, that faint sound of purring. It's ancient, familiar, permanent. Cats, let us think we chose them. We didn't. They chose us twice and then never left. So, tonight, as the story winds down and sleep hums at the edge of your mind, picture that small, unblinking presence beside early fires. Pyramids, ships, and apartments. Same eyes. Same calm. The oldest roommate in human history. Okay, breathe out. We've wandered far tonight. Thousands of years. From the first softpod hunters slipping through grain fields in Mesopotamia to the glowing rectangles of the digital age, where their descendants blink lazily back at us from millions of screens. And what's strange is, nothing about them really changed. Their tails still make the same slow rhythm. Their paws still land without sound. The gaze steady, uninterested, knowing is the same one that stared at campfires and pyramids. Cats moved through every era, like silent witnesses, watching humans paint temples, wage wars, build empires, then sit down and write poetry about loneliness. They watched it all and never took any of it personally. If you could piece together the entire human story through one continuous feline perspective, it would look oddly peaceful. All that noise, ambition, religion, science, politics stands somewhere in the background, the same soft creature stretching by the fire, pretending not to care. The first wildcat that wandered into a Neolithic settlement didn't mean to start anything. It just followed the sound of scurrying mice. But that quiet evening, when some early farmer left scraps out or looked over at that sleek striped shape and decided not to, Hetairoi, that was the start of something ancient and slightly absurd. A relationship with rules written entirely by implication. We feed them. They tolerate us. We talk to them. They blink. We think we own them. They humor us. It's not loyalty. Not exactly partnership. It's coexistence perfected into art. Maybe that's why cats feel so hypnotic. There's something groundingly primitive about them. They remind us of the steady pulse beneath chaos of the fact that some parts of the world never needed human approval to keep going. Every time a cat curls at your feet, it's a reminder that history but calm doesn't. Think of all the scenes across time where they appeared. A scribe in ancient Egypt, his ink drying under desert heat. A cat sleeping near his scrolls. A medieval monk, candlelight flickering, feeling a small body settle into the warmth of his robe. A sailor under foreign stars, stroking the ship's mouser while listening to the ocean sigh. A Victorian widow whispering secrets to her lapcat because no one else would listen. A tired office worker scrolling late at night, watching looping videos of kittens until the noise of the world quiets down. Different centuries. Same sound. Soft, rhythmic breathing. There is a theory in anthropology that humans didn't really tame cats. They simply created an environment that cats found worth staying in. That might be the deepest truth of their story. They never gave up freedom for domesticity. They just learned how to live alongside us on their own terms. Dogs became extensions of human purpose. Horses became symbols of conquest. Cats became something gentler, living reminders that companionship doesn't have to mean control. So when you see yours sleeping, stretched over the couch like some reincarnated pharaoh, that's history lying there. 6,000 years of effortless adaptation condensed into one elegant shape. A creature that survived gods, plagues, empires, and the invention of tick-to-call without losing the ability to nap 14 hours a day. The first farmers gave cats food. Egyptians gave them temples. Medieval Europe gave them fire and suspicion. Victorians gave them velvet cushions. The internet gave them infinite validation. And yet, through all of it, the cats gave exactly the same thing back. Quiet company and an unshakable impression that you are not, in fact, the master of this household. Maybe that's why they fascinate us so much. Every culture tried to make them something specific: symbols, omens, gods, memes, but they always stayed themselves. They belonged to no empire, no ideology, no need for approval. They exist perfectly balanced between affection and indifference. And somehow, that's comforting. So as you lie there now, maybe a cat somewhere curls up nearby, its breathing steady, its thoughts unreadable. You might wonder if it knows any of this history. It doesn't. And it wouldn't care even if it did. But that's the magic of it. We built stories around them because they never told us one back. They don't need to. They're the quiet punctuation to our endless noise. The soft, wordless assurance that even in all our striving, there's peace in stillness. And that's where we'll end tonight, with a world asleep, a little warmth in the dark, and the faint, ancient sound of someone purring at the edge of history. Hey guys, tonight we're heading somewhere different, far from polished palaces and powdered wigzao, into the wind and dust of the Eurasian steppe. So go ahead, dim the lights, let your mind quiet down. Tonight's story doesn't begin in a marble hall or a cathedral. It begins with a herd, small, muscular, perpetually chewing, and with a people who somehow use those short-legged, shaggy creatures to dominate half the planet. Yes, we're talking about the Mongols, or, more precisely, Mongol horse, and how an entire empire was built, quite literally, on their backs. Now, we tend to imagine the Mongols as unstoppable warrior zero-storms, galloping hordes, Genghis Khan glaring from beneath a beetle-browed helmet. But underneath all that grand myth was something deeply practical. The Mongol Empire wasn't held together by charisma or cruelty alone, it was held together by horses. Thousands of them. Possibly millions. The typical Mongol didn't just own a horse. He lived with them, breathed beside them, relied on them for milk, meat, travel, war, and probably emotional stability. Horses weren't tools. They were mobile infrastructure. Their success depended on understanding every twitch, every gust of wind across a herd's flank. Let's start with the animal itself. The Mongolian horse, stocky, hairy like a winter coat that never ends. From a distance, they look a bit too compact to conquer continents. They have short legs and wide heads. And if you saw one in a modern city, you might mistake it for a large pony with self-esteem. But these creatures were built for survival, not elegance. They could handle extremes of temperature from -40 in winter to blistering heat in summer. They could dig through snow to find grass. They could gallop for hours without water. And when food ran low, they could eat snow for moisture and keep going, which, frankly, is more than most medieval armies could do. Mongol horses also had one major advantage. They required no micromanagement. European knights coddled their chargers with stables, grain, and grooming. Mongol horses just existed. They lived outdoors all year. They grazed wherever they stood. No ibalis, no blacksmiths, no fancy stirrups imported from Italy. Just endless, resilient horseflesh under infinite sky. And that meant Mongol riders could move faster than anyone else in history. Literally faster than news itself. Genghis Khan's armies could cover 100 kilometers in a day. That's like outrunning your own logistics department, which they did constantly. Now, imagine being a European noble in the 13th century, strapping into plate armor, spending 3 hours mounting your horse, while a small Mongolian on a shaggy creature, the size of your cousin. Pony rides circles around you, fires 6 arrows, and vanishes before you've finished shouting your name. The cultural humiliation was immense. But part of the secret was in numbers. Mongol warriors didn't ride one horse. They rode 5 or 6. Each man had a small, mobile stable trailing along with the herd. When one horse got tired, he'd simply switch to the next. The exhausted one would graze, recover, and rejoin later. It was a perfect system of renewable horsepower. They even drank horse milk, fermented into ereg, the mildly alcoholic, slightly fizzy national beverage of the steppe. It tasted like yogurt that decided to become rebellious. But that drink gave energy, hydration, and sometimes comfort during long rides. And when things got truly desperate, soldiers would make small cuts on a horse's neck and drink its blood carefully enough not to hurt the animal. That's how intertwined they were. It wasn't cruelty. It was survival biology perfected into loyalty. Now, let's pause here, because every Mongol warrior's relationship with his horse was almost ritualistic. Horses were named, blessed, sung about in songs, adorned with charms to ward off evil spirits. A rider might forget his armor, but never forget his mare's lineage. These were the true passports of the steppe-living extensions of individual identity. Think of the early teenage boys training for war. They were expected to ride before they could walk properly, shoot from horseback before most kids in Europe could hold a spoon. Archery wasn't a standalone skillet, was performed in full gallop, twisted backward, sometimes shooting behind at chasing enemies. That level of control required absolute harmony between man and horse. The line between them blurred into one organism of balance and motion. We often talk about cavalry tactics in history as if they were mechanical, but for the Mongols it was almost spiritual. Control didn't mean domination, it meant flow. The rider guided, trusted, and adjusted. Horses learned to read intent from pressure, breath, or even subtle posture changes. A Mongol army in movement must have looked less like a regiment and more like a tide. And that tide didn't need roads. Grass, dust, Siberian, snow, Persian dunes, it was all one continuous plain to them. When Genghis Khan finally unified the Mongol tribes, his great innovation wasn't just politics, it was logistics on horseback. He built a relay system, the yam, using horses stationed along vast postal routes. Riders could deliver messages, reports, and intelligence at a blistering pace. Imagine the 13th century equivalent of express shipping powered by horses instead of fiber optics. Every few kilometers, a new steed waited at a small outpost. The courier would leap off one and on to the next, without stopping. The system spanned thousands of miles across Asia, from the Mongolian steppes to the edges of Eastern Europe. Humans built empires out of stone. The Mongols built theirs out of hoofbeats. And yet, for all their efficiency, the Mongols kept things minimal. Saddles were lightweight, stirrups simple, reins effortless. No banners or glitz, just leather, wool, and silence. The soundscape of a Mongol camp wasn't clanging armor, it was wind, grass, and the soft nickering of 100,000 mouths chewing. It's funny, really these men were seen as barbarians by their enemies. But their horse culture was gentler than most medieval relationships with animals. They never whipped or overburdened their mounts unnecessarily. A dead horse wasn't a resource. It was a loss mourned quietly before moving on. At night, the ties between man and animal deepened further. Horses were milked, brushed, kept near tents for warmth. If you fell asleep beside one in the cold, its breath could keep you from freezing. Little rituals formed between riders and mares' touches. Whispers, small gestures of thanks before battle. For those born on the steppe, those animals weren't property. They were pieces of home. Let's drift a bit deeper into the logistics again, because it's almost poetic how unstable their system was. No stables, no fences, no feed storage. The entire setup floated across land, endlessly adapting to seasons. Mongol families followed pastures like flowing nomadic streams. Every member, even children and elders, managed horses. The empire wasn't just mobile, it was a living organism of herding. Herders could identify their animals by sound. Each horse had a unique neigh or footfall pattern. They'd recognize their own mares in total darkness. Try that in a European stable filled with 100 nearly identical deaths. The Mongols didn't domesticate horses to be obedient, they let them stay half wild and smarter for it. That independence made them far more capable in battle. When an arrow whistled or drums rumbled, a Mongol horse didn't panic, it moved, adapted, blended back into formation like water changing course. Even their breeding philosophy reflected this self-sufficiency. There were no controlled studs or selective breeding pens. They valued resilience over appearance. Horses reproduced naturally, roaming free. Surviving the bitter winters was the only qualification for continuing the genetic line. Beauty was measured in endurance. Compare that to the aristocratic horse breeding of the same era, Spaniards pampering and Persians grooming palace horses until they gleamed. Meanwhile, out on the steppes, a windswept mare who'd survived a blizzard on wild grass was suddenly worth more than gold. And if you think the Mongols didn't appreciate beauty, you should hear their songs. Steppe ballads spoke of horses that understood dreams, that guided warriors home across endless plains, that carried the souls of the dead. Every nation writes love poems. The steppe wrote them for horses. Yet, behind that sentiment was ruthless practicality. A horse that faltered too often or failed to reproduce wasn't celebrated, it was eaten. Horse meat sustained warriors during long campaigns. Boiled into simple meals. Salted for travel. The animal's life, strength, and end all served one communal pulse. It's easy to romanticize this culture, to picture endless sunsets and heroic silhouettes. But really, it was less cinematic, more cyclical. Horses weren't symbolic, they were inevitable. A Mongol without his horse was practically unpersoned. And this ecosystem of loyalty and pragmatism became the backbone of history's largest contiguous empire. Every conquest, message, tax, or census in Mongol bureaucracy passed through hooves first. When Genghis Khan's descendants stretched their influence from Korea to Hungary, what bound them wasn't bloodline or lot, was sheer mobility. Horses gave them that impossible reach, and because they saw the animal as an equal in endurance, never just a servant, they outmatched every static civilization they encountered. The great cities of Asia thought power came from walls. The Mongols knew it grew from open ground. Let's drift along the grasslands once more. Now the night quiet, stars sharp, frost creeping softly over the steppe. Herds move like shadows, unhurried and unafraid. A rider checks his gear, pats the neck of his horse, whispers something before mounting. Then they vanished together into the dark horizon. Horse and rider, two silhouettes moving as one rhythm. That's where the real empire lived, not in palaces or pyramids, but in that perfect understanding between human and animal. All right, we're back on the steppe tonight. You can almost hear it, the constant hum of grass in the wind, the soft clatter of hooves somewhere in the distance. This world feels endless. No borders, no walls, just motion. And within that motion, a quiet system, ancient, deliberate, and utterly practical. Because while the rest of history's rulers were marrying their cousins to keep dynasties alive, the Mongols were arranging marriages of their own. Specifically, between horses. Mongol horse breeding wasn't glamorous, but it was genius. Entire bloodlines of empire ran on those herds. No stables, no pedigrees carved into stone. Just instinct honed over centuries. If the European knightly bloodlines were all about prestige, Mongol herds were all about survival. Let's begin with the basics. Selection. Every year, herders would choose the strongest, most enduring mares, and the calmest, most intelligent stallions for breeding. That sounds ordinary, but the criteria went far beyond strength. The real question wasn't how fast is this horse, but will this horse survive winter? You could have the fastest animal in the world, but if it panicked in a snowstorm or couldn't find grass under 5 inches of frost, it was useless. Steppe logic didn't care about racing or form. It cared about a horse that kept its nerve against wolves or cold wind was worth breeding. The ritual began when spring softened the land. After the long freeze, mares foaled under open skies. No barns or fences to shield them. Foaling was almost a community. Event herders kept vigil. Children helped. Mothers guarded. Calves born early were wrapped lightly in felt, not to protect from cold, but to dry off quickly in the chill air. The logic was simple. A colt that couldn't stand by itself on the first day wouldn't live long anyway. Harsh, but efficient. Mongol horses belonged to herds, not humans. Even though families claimed ownership, the animals moved in semi-wild groups, grazing across huge territories. The only markers were simple brands burnt onto their hides, symbols of lineage, usually tiny emblems representing the clan. No coats of arms, no banners. Just a reminder that this creature was part of someone's moving universe, and the herders knew every detail. They could trace which mare foaled which colt 5 years back, just by looking at the curve of a neck or the flicker of a tail. Family lineage might have been a mess among Mongol princes, but the horse genealogies never collapsed. It's worth remembering, this wasn't selective breeding in the modern sense. There were no controlled enclosures or genetic goals. It was natural selection with a touch of supervision. If winter killed the weak ones, that was nature doing quality control. Survival itself became the breeding standard. But don't picture total chaos. It wasn't random either. Stallions were rotated carefully to avoid conflicts and exhaustion. A herder might tie up aggressive males or separate prized mares before introducing new mates. Certain bloodlines were believed to bring good fortune: swift-footed bay horses or white mares descended from heaven's herd. That phrase brings us to the spiritual layer. The Mongols didn't just manage herds, they revered them. Horses held sacred associations long before Genghis Khan ever raised a banner. They were gifts of the eternal blue sky Tengar, divine bridges between earth and heaven. When a thunderstorm rolled across the plains, riders sometimes believed it was the sound of celestial herds galloping above. Even rituals of blessing reflected this bond. Before major journeys or battles, herders sprinkled kumis, fermented mare's milk, toward the sky, whispering thanks to Tengar for providing the herd's strength. Horses were brushed, touched softly across their foreheads, as if to receive luck through contact. And yes, that probably did more for morale than logistics, but the spiritual logic ran deep. Every foal born healthy meant renewal, not just for a family, but for the whole tribe. The herding cycle repeated each year with mathematical rhythm. Summer meant long-distance grazing. Autumn brought rounding up and marking young stock. Winter meant survival drills. A family's worth wasn't calculated in gold, it was measured in horses. Wealth was literally mobile. A successful herder might own 200. A noble might command thousands. The great khans measured tribute not in silver, but in mares. Tribute lists from the Empire's archives often read like equestrian poetry. 10 white mares for drinking kumis under moonlight. 5 stallions from the Black Sands. Taxes could come in the form of hooves. Now, let us wander into the part of Mongol life that bridged culture and Carthaway horses were treated daily. Because, while their breeding was practical, their behavior toward them was strikingly tender. Each morning, horses were checked, not for grooming in any fancy sense, but for comfort. Saddles came off as soon as rides ended to prevent sores. Water was shared. Riders often knelt and let animals drink first. After long campaigns, soldiers massaged their horses' necks and legs by hand. This wasn't sentimentality, it was investment protection, step style. Even their attack was designed for comfort. The Mongol saddle sat high, lightweight, slightly curved for balance. It let riders shoot arrows in all directions. Side or backward without The stirrups gave stability, but still allowed a kind of standing posture, reducing fatigue for both horse and rider. It's almost comical that this minimal setup outperformed centuries of European design. But simplicity works best when you're racing across continents. Regarding feeding, there was no formal routine. Horses grazed on long grasslands, and herders rotated them like moving farmlands. During hard winters, they kicked through snow to reach buried vegetation. If things got dire, humans cut rough grass and dried it near their tents. Not ideal, but enough. Some even melted ice for drinking water and hand-fed their mounts. Handfuls of snow. If a horse survived that, it became legend in the herd. Let's talk about color superstition. Because of course, there were superstitions. Chestnut horses were seen as lucky, white ones divine, black ones courageous. Genghis Khan supposedly rode a gray horse that never stumbled, which sounds exactly like a detail he'd insist upon. Warriors assigned horses by fate and color before campaigns, often swapping when omens seemed bad. The red mare goes south, the black stallion stays home. Even naming them was careful business. Mongols gave horses short, vivid names often relating to natural traits. Thunder, smoke, windtail, kopis. Nothing poetic, nothing human. They weren't companions, so much as extensions of the environment. And it worked. When the Mongol armies expanded westward in the 13th century through Persia, the Caucasus, into Eastern Europe, every army division brought roughly 5 horses per warrior. If 1,000 men were marching, they traveled with 5,000 horses. It wasn't just cavalry, it was mobile ecology. The empire grew like a living landscape of hoofprints, reborn each season through breeding and care. Now, there's an interesting twist in all this. Mongol horses weren't bred for uniformity. You could look at a typical herd and notice how different they were from one another. Some broad-chested, others lean. Some dark and shaggy, others pale with thin coats. This variety made the herd incredibly adaptable. A single wildfire, plague, or weather shift couldn't wipe them out. Nature diversified them better than any pedigree chart could, and humans learned their rhythms intimately. A herder could sense disease before a horse showed symptoms. Tiny signs, like heavy breathing or twitching skin. They used herbal washes and smoke treatments from dried herbs to heal wounds. No veterinarians, just inherited wisdom from grandparents who'd watched horses outlast the horizon. Breeding was timed to match natural cycles. Stallions were released during the spring mating season when pastures grew lush. Foals born in early summer had months of warmth to strengthen before winter. Timing was everything. The whole calendar spun around the herd. Birth, grazing, migration, restan, entire human year mapped to equine life. And of course, there were festivals. The Nodum Games, wrestling, archery, and horse racing were celebrations of vitality itself. Children as young as 5 raced bareback 4 miles. Their small frames more aerodynamic than adults. Winning horses weren't given prizes. They were sung to. Their sweat was collected as a lucky charm, thought to bring prosperity to the herd. It all sounds romantic, but beneath it was practical devotion. Because if the horses failed, everything failed. Food, travel, war. Breeding seasons and military campaigns were balanced on the same rhythm. Empire and ecology shared one heartbeat. Imagine that horizon now with thousands of herds stretching in all directions. Wind flattening grass, foals stumbling beside their mothers, riders checking saddles at dawn. The herd was the empire's pulse, soft but constant. That is the secret no monument ever captured. Not the conquests or the golden hordes, but the quiet, relentless care behind them. The breeding of survival itself. All right, so we've bred them, raised them, worshipped them a little, and occasionally shared a drink with them. But now the real question: how do you turn an entire species of compact, shaggy animals into the most terrifying military machine in medieval history? Because the Mongols didn't just ride horses, they programmed them. You could say their cavalry was the closest thing the 13th century had to artificial intelligence. Fast and slightly unpredictable, but terrifyingly effective once set in motion. Training a Mongol horse wasn't like drilling a ceremonial charger or pampering a knight's prized stallion. It was more like raising a partner in survival. The process began early, often before the horse was even fully grown. By age 2, colts were introduced to human handling, not with whips or reins, but with presence. Mongol herdis believe in living among the herd, not commanding it from above. Foals were let loose around the camp, growing used to human voices, cooking smoke, and tense sounds. When the time came to break them in, no harsh tack or shouting. Just patience. A herder would spend hours sitting near the young horse, humming softly or feeding small handfuls of grass. Sometimes they'd tie a light saddled blanket on first, then sit astride without moving, letting the horse adjust. It was irritation through familiarity, not force. The horse learned humans weren't predators. They were weird, hairless herd members who kept showing up for conversations. And once that trust existed, the real work began. The first thing to learn was balance. Mongol horses were naturally short and stocky. It made falling less disastrous, which helped the training process. Young riders practiced without stirrups, standing while galloping, shooting with both hands, twisting, leaning backward, hanging sideways. If that sounds acrobatic, it was. Mongol riding wasn't graceful like jousting, it was controlled chaos. Remember, this wasn't about ceremonial posture, it was about survival mobility. A Mongol warrior had to shoot arrows behind him while retreating, gallop over rough terrain without looking down, or pull tricks like faking a fall to ambush pursuers. And the horses had to match that rhythm. They didn't just gallop, they danced in sync with every twitch of their rider's body. That required intuitive communicational generations of selective understanding. Even animals born wild learned to anticipate subtle pressure cues. Knee tightening meant speed up, hip shift meant pivot, 2 taps on the neck meant stop quietly. Reins were optional. Instinct wasn't. Mongol horses were so attuned, they could be guided with minimal input, freeing the warrior. As Hans for constant archery, medieval chroniclers from Persia and Europe couldn't believe it. They called it sorcery, because while their knights were still struggling to reload a crossbow mid-charge, Mongols were firing 6 arrows in as many seconds at full speed, backwards. But before we turn this into an action movie montage, let's slow down. Life on the steppe trained horses before humans ever did. Wide horizons, predators, temperature extremes, all that turned every colt into a graduate of natural boot camp. By the time riders started their work, the horses were already experts in staying calm, finding footing, and following the herd's flow. One of the most fascinating aspects of Mongol cavalry training was their use of flocks for simulation. Herding sheep or goats wasn't just economic, it was practice for battlefield maneuvers. The sweeping turns, sudden shifts, and collective movement of livestock mirrored the tactics they'd later use in war. Horses and riders learned together, one brain per species, one rhythm shared, and the tactics were pure deception. The famous feigned retreat maneuver. It only worked because horses were so reliable. Warriors would charge an enemy line, fire, then deliberately wheel away and retreat. The pursuers, thinking victory was near, would follow until the Mongols turned mid-gallop, releasing arrows backward from steady, obedient mounts. Chaos for the enemy, perfection for the pair. Horses were trained for silence too. At night, they could move across soft soil or snow without snorting or clattering metal. The secret? Mongols removed anything that jingled. No ornamental chains. No iron soys. Bare hooves, quiet breath, soft steps. Armies could travel unseen until dawn broke, and the first sound anyone heard was the whistle of arrows. It's eerie when you think about it. Tens of thousands of horses, perfectly silent in the dark. Their riders whispering to them in low voices. You wouldn't see them coming, you'd just feel the ground start to hum. Of course, training wasn't just for war. Everyday horses had no domestic commands too. For instance, mares were trained to tolerate milking while grazing, even when half asleep. Stallions had to learn not to charge at other males during roundups. It's a delicate balance, affection and authority, maintained every day through tone, not punishment. One account by a Chinese chronicler in the Yuan dynasty noted that Mongols could make their horses cross rivers and ice, as though walking the earth. They used simple cues lining forward for courage, soft chanting to calm them in storms. If a horse panicked, the rider didn't beat a they, simply waited. Discipline was patience disguised as detachment, which worked because Mongol horses hated showing weakness, much like their riders. And yes, there were specialized training areas too, not arenas, just open grass. Horses practiced turning in tight formations, stopping instantly at a whistle, or splitting in groups of 10 and 20. War wasn't just one rider. It was hundreds of pairs acting like a single animal. When a commander raised his whip, every mount knew what was happening before the men did. Part of that communication came from scents and sounds. Mongols deliberately raised war bands together with their herds, so the animals recognized each other's smell. That prevented panic in large formations. Imagine that, horses as social soldiers, bonded by familiarity instead of fear. And let us not forget one of the most jarringly modern aspects of Mongol cavalry: rotation and recovery. Horses weren't pushed beyond exhaustion. If one weakened, the rider switched mounts immediately. The tired horse was led gently behind the others, still within the herd. When they stopped at camp, the rider might sing softly a low, steady tune to calm the sweating animals. Step songs weren't human art. They were breathing exercises for the herd. Even after battles, the horses were cared for first. Wounds washed with fermented milk, legs rubbed with fat mixtures, breathing checked. Riders might collapse, but the horses still got their meal. The Mongols knew an empire can lose soldiers and recover, but if it lost the herd, the story ended. Some accounts describe generals inspecting soldiers' horses more strictly than weapons. A dull blade could be sharpened, a trembling mount was a liability. Genghis Khan himself supposedly punished warriors more for neglecting a horse than for losing supplies, because one could be replaced, the other couldn't. Now, let's talk about the incredible endurance training. Mongol horses could travel 70 miles in a single day, sometimes more. How? Gradual conditioning through daily movement. Steppe horses were never still. Even when not on campaign, they roamed miles for grazing. Their muscles never forgot motion, so when the time came for war, they didn't need training camps. They were always ready. They learned from foals to conserve energy, trotting softly, sipping from puddles instead of large gulps, finding edible shrubs during drought. These small, quiet lessons became the Mongol edge. A European charger might collapse after one hard ride. A Mongol horse could keep pacing for 10 more. And sometimes the riders pushed that endurance into legend. If a message needed to reach Karakorum immediately, relay couriers could swap horses every 30 kilometers. That's not just staminite synchronization across ecosystems. Let's slow down again now. Picture an early morning on the steppe, fog hugging the grass, dew glistening on hooves, riders mounting bareback for practice, bows strung tight, the air tasting like smoke and milk. They ride in circles, trot in silence, then fan out over the plains in perfect sequence, each man slightly hunched forward, the horses almost floating, as if running on memory. That's the unspoken bond between Mongol and horse. Not domination, but symmetry. Humans provided vision, horses provided endurance. Together, they became one body that stretched across continents. By the time Genghis Khan's banners reached the Caspian Sea, half of Eurasia had learned to fear the sound of distant hoofbeats. But the horses never knew fear, they only knew rhythm. Let's float forward next time into what happened when these mounted armies met settled civilizations, how Mongol horsemanship decimated defining empires and rewrote geography, but also how their deep understanding of animal life echoed in everything they built: roads, postal systems, even their laws. Let's breathe again for a moment. The fire's low, the wind's quiet, and in the distance you can almost hear that soft, even sound, thousands of hooves drumming across open earth. That's the sound of the world's most efficient communications network before fiber optics, before telegrams, before someone decided pigeons were reliable. In this part, we're leaving the training circles and battlefields behind. We're floating into the empire itself, into the living highway system that tied it all together. Because once you've mastered horse breeding and training, the next logical step is to rewire civilization with them. And that's exactly what the Mongols did. Most empires treat animals as afterthoughts. The Romans built roads for marching feet. The Persians built aqueducts for water. The Mongols built everything for horses: transportation, information, taxation. Their entire administration ran on hooves. It was called the yam system. And no, not the root vegetabiam, derived from a Turkic word for stop or station. Imagine it as the 13th century internet, except each postmaster carried weapons and smelled like fermented milk. Here's how it worked. Across tens of thousands of miles from the frozen steppe to the deserts of Persia, relay stations were set up about every 25 to 30 miles apart. Each station housed a few yurts, some supplies, and, of course, a small stable of fresh horses. A courier would gallop in, hand off his message or switch to a fresh horse, drink a quick bowl of mare's milk, and bolt off again. Day and night, this happened in rhythm. Messages, orders, tribal updates, maps, and, occasionally, gossip about governors crossing continents in record time. A message could travel 1,000 miles in a few days. For comparison, European kingdoms in the same era considered it efficient if an order reached a border in 2 weeks. The Mongols were living in the fast lane, centuries early. But the yam wasn't just about soldiers. It was for everyone, well, everyone important enough to earn a pesa, a bronze or gold tablet of authority issued by the Khan. This little badge said, "I'm allowed to use imperial horses and eat imperial food." Think of it as a cross between a passport, a VIP pass, and an early Uber account. With it, you could gallop across Asia without paying taxes or stopping for paperwork. Merchants, envoys, and spies all used the yam too. The empire was obsessed with information: who owed grain, who was rebelling, what the weather was doing 3,000 miles away, and at the center of it all, their network of horses held it together. You could almost say the Mongol Empire wasn't a map, it was a vibration, a thrum shed by millions of hooves moving east to west. Let's picture one rider. He's traveling from Karakorum to Samarkand-Rufli. The distance from Berlin to Baghdad. The wind blasts. The grass changes color with each region. And every 30 miles, there's a new station. He switches mounts, again and again. Each fresh horse, trained by locals who've cared for the herds since before the empire began. That's how stable the system was. It relied not on technology, but on human and animal partnership, repeated endlessly across landscape. And that rhythm out, dismount, refuel, ride, repeat for days became the empire's pulse. Every shout, every decree, every plan passed through a horse first. Now, it's kind of poetic that the Mongols, who never wrote epic poems about love or mountains, ended up writing the world's fastest postal poem about connect. Their secret was consistency. Each messenger was expected to ride until the horse's sweat had dried 3 times before stopping. That's an actual measurement of distance in Mongol time. 1-3's wet run. The empire literally measured geography through horse exhaustion. And what about maintenance? The yam system wasn't free. Of course, local populations were responsible for feeding, housing, and replacing horses. Sometimes entire villages existed just to support one station. It was bureaucracy by hoofprint, and it worked far better than anything parchment-bound Europe attempted for another 3 centuries. But beyond its brilliance, it also showed something deeper. It revealed how Mongols saw movement. For them, stillness was failure. Roads weren't physical, they were transient, as alive as the herds drifting across them. You can hear echoes of that worldview in how they governed conquered lands. They didn't force everyone to become nomads, but they reorganized everything: tax routes, military chains, even messages to mimic the flow of the steppe. Cities were tolerated, but motion was worshipped. It was as if the empire's lifeblood couldn't afford to clot, and their horses mirrored that philosophy perfectly. Constant motion, minimal consumption, maximum output. The yam was powered by the same endurance ethic as the battlefield cavalry. It wasn't just a postal service, it was a living embodiment of the Mongol waylight, fast and impossible to block. Even their diplomacy rode on it. Envoys carried letters sealed by golden tablets, directing foreign rulers to submit peaceably or else. Those little letters crossed mountains and forests by horse in record time, and the sheer speed of arrival terrified recipients. Imagine being a medieval king, sitting at your table, and suddenly receiving a letter that had somehow outrun your rumors. That's how empires fall to disbelief first, and defeat second. When Marco Polo eventually traveled through Mongol lands, he couldn't stop gushing about the relay network. He described seeing stations every few miles, with fresh horses waiting, herders ready, and riders who moved as swift as birds. Historians used to think Marco exaggerated things. Then archaeologists found remnants of the actual post stations, perfectly confirming it. Turns out, the Mongols really were that organized. And the efficiency didn't stop there. Horses weren't only couriers, they were field intelligence units. Scouts rode ahead of armies by hundreds of miles, carrying compact signals via trained horses. If danger emerged, they fired flaming arrows at night, or released trained falcons during the day because, yes, apparently, carrier birds were just another steppe accessory. The important thing was that horses kept information alive. In the medieval world, ignorance killed faster than swords, and the Mongols refused to be ignorant. Of course, this constant mobility required divine levels of maintenance. Over a quarter of the empire's population at one point worked in horse management, herding, transporting, healing, breeding replacements. Entire provinces were devoted to cavalry reserves. The horse wasn't an animal anymore, it was a state employee. And yet, despite the scale, Mongols never clotted their system with rules. There were low strict ones about stealing or overworking horses, but they didn't buried it in paperwork. Everything was trust-based to rule. Witnessed. Fast. A courier didn't carry receipts, just a little plaque with an official emblem. Empty promises might fail, but horse legs never lied. Let's drift a little here, to the quieter side of governance. When the great khans wanted to issue decrees, they gathered horsemen at dawn. Messengers memorized every word, then galloped off in different directions, each carrying light tokens for proof. By dusk, those words were already echoing hundreds of miles away. It's easy to forget that the Mongol Empire, at its height, connected more landmass than Rome, Persia, and Alexander Combandan held it together without telegraphs, without walls, without seas. Just horses. The most remarkable part, communication wasn't one way. The yam worked upward too. Local governors could send messages to the capital with the same efficiency. Information circulated, instead of stagnating at the top. For a medieval empire, that was unheard of, and you can still see traces of it in modern Mongolia. Even now, the postal symbol of the country incorporates the idea of relay travel. It's like they never forgot that their ancestors built the first civilization, shaped entirely by motion. Imagine what it looked like from above, riders cutting through golden plains, horse tails streaming in wind, tents glowing faint orange at every outpost. The network pulsed, day and night, like veins of the earth illuminated by moonlight and hooves. And somewhere in Karakoram, a Khan could sit by the fire, drink arag, and know that every message he sent might already be halfway to the Black Sea. Because that's how fast the world turned when horses replaced wires. Let's float, slowly, toward the twilight of that age next. When the empire began to settle, when horses found new roles in trade caravans, instead of conquests, and when the rhythm of hoofbeats faded into the pages of chronicle writers who'd never ridden one. Let's settle back in. Our empire of hooves is thundering less now. The horizon is widening again. But peace time, not for conquests, for wandering. Tonight, we drift through the quieter centuries, when the Mongols started trading instead of raiding, breeding instead of burning, and their horses turned from engines of war into quiet companions of memory. Empires don't end with explosions. They exhale. And the Mongol Empire, sprawling, pulsing, impossibly alive through its networks, finally began to slow when the hooves started spacing out. Not because they lost their strength, but because they no longer had a world left to conquer. After the great Khans fractured their territories, Yuan China, the Ilkhanate, the Golden Horde, each successor, inherited not just land, but herds. Horses remained the arteries of all the fragmented states. But their purposes changed. Where once they carried warriors, now they carried good silk, spice, furs, silver coin. Those same horses that once saw towns in flames were now tied to caravans delivering bolts of fabric and bolts of news. Let's float east first, into Yuan China under Kublai Khan. The dynasty still relied heavily on the yam system, now repurposed for running an imperial bureaucracy that looked half Chinese, half steppe-born. Fresh horses for officials, envoys, and traders kept the empire breathing. Records from the Yuan archives mention over 50,000 relay horses across northern China alone. That's not so much an army as a living telegraph. But here's the thing, the horses themselves started changing. Steppe breeds intermingled with northern Chinese and Turkic lines, creating stronger, larger hybrids. The pragmatic elegance of the old Mongol pony began blending with new aesthetics of empire. They were now expected to be noble, not merely useful. And once animals become status symbols, you know the system's shifting. Across Central Asia, the transformation was even more noticeable. The Golden Horde carried Mongol horsemanship into Russia, reshaping local riding traditions. Steppe horses bred with Slavic ones. A few centuries later, you get the early ancestors of the Cossack mounts, hardy, short-tempered, and almost impossible to exhaust. A perfectly accidental legacy. Further west, the Ilkhanate in Persia fused Mongol practicality with Persian artistry. Horses became part of lavish processions and royal hunts, adorned with silver tassels and silk fabrics. What used to be military gear turned decorative. The saddles grew heavier, which is always a bad sign of decadence. When an empire's saddles start getting heavier, its armies start getting slower. But even amid this slow ceremonial drift, the old nomadic code didn't disappear. Herders on the steppe still lived the same way, far removed from the noise of Kublai's palaces. They followed grazing routes, sang the same songs to their mares, and wandered with that same unbothered rhythm that had sustained the Mongols long before conquest found them. It's strange, by the 14th century, the cities that benefited from Mongol trade routes owed their prosperity to the same horses their ancestors had once feared. What was once an invasion road became the Silk Road. The hoofprints of war turned into trade tracks, and it's here, slipping along those trade routes, that the Mongol horse spirit begins to spread beyond bloodlines. The techniques, the craft, the attitude. People learned from them. Persians adopted steppe saddles. Arabs admired their endurance. Chinese breeders absorbed their breeding principles. Even Europe, once terrified of nomadic cavalry, quietly borrowed their innovations. When gunpowder arrived, horses didn't lose their value, they adapted again. Mongol descendants fused cavalry tactics with firearm use, creating terrifying hybrid armies across Asia. But slowly, the world's pace changed. Gunfire outsped arrow wars, and steppe thunder faded under the march of cannons. Still, the Mongol herds survived everything: division, gunpowder, time. Because unlike cities and rulers, horses don't rebel. They just keep grazing. Let's slow down and look at domestic life again. Around the 1400s. The herds are smaller now, but no less sacred. Families name their best mares, keep small shrines with horsehair tokens, whisper prayers on birthdays of falls. The great Khans might be gone, but every household still follows silent rituals before riding out. A soft pat on the neck, a quiet tug at the mane asking permission, not showing mastery. When you look at Mongolian folk songs from that era, they are filled with farewell verses to horses. not warriors, not king's horses. For instance, one song speaks of a brother with 4 legs, whose breath warms the winter. Another describes a mare that walks from yesterday into tomorrow without stopping. Poetic understatement was their specialty. Meanwhile, the wider world was beginning to forget how dependent it had once been on hooves. Europe had carriages now. China had river barges. Persia rebuilt gardens instead of grazing fields. Even in Mongolia, the remaining tribes started forming early alliances with Chinese dynasties, exchanging horses for tea, grain, and metal goods. And so, the animal that once carried empires started quietly feeding them instead. In a way, it's fitting. The Mongol horse didn't vanish, it just retired gracefully. Let's follow one caravan for a moment. It's 1450, heading west from Karakoram, carrying silk, furs, and dried fish. The path winds through familiar valleys where ancestors once camped. The riders drink arag, sing under the stars, watch their horses graze by moonlight, and those horses descendants of the same fierce animals that once outran armies Arkamna. Their breath fogs under the cold. Their tails flick lazily against the quiet wind. They have no idea their kind once ruled the earth. Mongol horse culture survived not as dominance, but as it thrived quietly in villages, games, and rituals. Nodamreazes, still held to this day, are living fossils of empire. The same thundering plains, the same ancestral songs echoing across fields. It's funny how some legacies fade into monuments, while others keep breathing. The Mongols never built cathedrals or pyramids. Their memorials, the herds, still running beneath the same blue sky. Even the modern Mongolian cavalry units up until the 20th century trained on principles older than most countries. Mobility, patience, silence. You could still trace Genghis Khan's policies in how they treated their mounts with care. With symmetry, with something like quiet reverence. And today, if you walk this steppe, you'll still find those small herds grazing against the horizon. Short, stocky, unbothered by cold winds and history's noise. It's the same breed maybe, a little more photo-friendly now, but genetically, spiritually, practically the same. Because while empires rust, weather, and vanish, the steppe keeps its rhythm. The horses don't care who the emperor is anymore. They just keep moving toward grass. So as we reach the end of this long ride, remember this. The Mongols built the largest continuous empire in human history, but its foundation wasn't tea gold, or stone, or even human ambition. It was trust. The quiet trust between rider and horse, forged under wind and frost, strong enough to carry half the world. And when the riders disappeared, the trust stayed. You can still hear it sometimes, if you listen closely, Anatha Solf, ancient sound in the grasslands of Mongolia, where the ground seems to hum beneath the weight of hoofbeats long gone. Maybe that's history's most peaceful ending, the world's biggest memory, grazing quietly. All right, take a breath. The empire is gone, now the palaces drifted into dust, the banners lowered, and the names of its conquerors scattered into textbooks. But if you stand in the Mongolian steppe at sunset, where the grass ripples like water under a passing wind, it feels as though nothing really ended. You still hear the low whinny of horses, carried on that breeze like history humming its own memory. We've reached the quiet part of this story. The part where time slows down, and the legends dissolve into silence. What's left is the trace of hoofprints pressed not just into earth, but into human imagination. Because, somehow, an animal that stood barely 15 hands tall became the backbone of the largest land empire in the world. And yet, it never stopped being a horse-muddy, stubborn, hungry, and perfectly the empire they built together, man and horse left. No grand architecture. No marble temples. No palaces carved into cliffs. The Mongols' legacy was movement itself. Everything they built was alive, breathing, grazing, moving west with the horizon. When we talk about the Mongol horse, it's easy to picture conquest armies flooding over mountains, arrows flying like rain. But history's best-kept secret is that the real empire wasn't measured in bloodshed. It was measured in endurance. No other power on earth ever turned mobility into a philosophy quite like the Mongols did. And it wasn't because of strategy, was because of the relationship between humans and their animals. That bond was more than practical. It was existential. A Mongol knew that his horse's survival determined his own. When a storm came, they huddled together. When hunger struck, they shared resources. When a life ended, they mourned with quiet dignity. The horse wasn't wealth or weaponette, was reflection. The steppe taught that everything alive had one job: to keep moving. You can feel that lesson lingering in modern Mongolia even now, in the way nomadic herders still migrate across open land with their herds, in the way families still sing lullabies that mention horses before the names of children, in the way horses are still blessed before races, their manes braided with blue silk ribbons to honor the eternal sky. The Mongolian horse today might look a little smaller, a little softer, but it's the same lineage. Still grazing wild, still able to survive blizzards that would end most animals in hours. The Bondasan tea weakened with Timits just become quieter. You won't find giant armies anymore, but you'll still find riders who can whisper a single sound and have a horse follow them across miles of wind. It's strange how such silence birthed a chapter of human history so loud. The Mongol thundering conquest defined an age, reshaped Asia, and bridged east and west. Yet when it ended, the noise drained away, leaving only the whisper of horses. Maybe that's history's small joke, the sound that once terrified empires now soothes them. If you think about it, the legacy of those horses is everywhere. Every mounted army that came after, every courier network, every image of freedom tied to the open road, all of it borrowed pieces of the steppe. Even the modern romantic idea of the bond between rider and horse sprang from nomadic origins, long before Europe painted it into oil portraits. And what's left now isn't tragedy. It's peace. The world remembers the chaos, the domination, the empire. But on the steppe, memory has no interest in drama. It lives in motion, in migrations that never seek monuments, only seasons. When you stand out there under the sky, the same wide dome the Mongols called Tendoryu, can almost imagine what they felt. That infinite calm under endless wind, the feel of the world quietly existing without need for permanence. The Mongols saw no difference between empire and pasture. Both were temporary, but their horses, they were continuity itself. Every nomadic empire rises and falls, but the herds remain. Through frost, drought, and centuries of political imagination, they remain. Somewhere, under that same sun, a mare is having a foal, just as her ancestors did when Genghis Khan was a teenager chasing wild sheep instead of titles. Nothing's changed, except our sense of amazement. The Mongols built the world's first truly global system on horseback, and when it fell apart, what survived wasn't their diplomacy, their cities, or even their myths. It was the philosophy of endurance: keep moving, stay minimal, trust the bond that keeps you alive. That's not just the secret of an empire. It's the secret of being human, because deep down, we still live by that rhythm. We still measure our progress in distance covered, in journeys taken, in what we carry with us. The Mongols may have mastered that lesson on horseback, but we continue it behind wheels, wires, and Wi-Fi. The speed changed, but the instinct didn't. Let's pause a moment longer, though. The fire's down to embers now. We've followed this story through snow and dust, through conquerors and caravans, through birth rituals and battlefields. So, what's left? Maybe just this: a quiet field somewhere in Mongolia, where herds move like waves beneath the twilight sky. No empires, no generals, no echoes of command, just rhythm. You could close your eyes and hear it. The whisper of grass, the soft sound of hoofs, and the slow breathing of the earth. That's where the empire still exists. Not in books, not in ruins, but in motion. In the wind. In the wind, and in every heartbeat that remembers how to travel lightly. So, if tonight's story lulls you to sleep, imagine the hum of those old hooves fading into distance. The steppe is endless, and so is memory. Somewhere far out there, the Mongols are still riding, and their horses are still carrying them home. And that's where we'll bring the story to a soft close tonight. If you're still awake, impressive. Most empires didn't last this long, so take a slow breath. Let the images of endless grass and quiet hoofbeats drift out of focus. If your pet is nearby, maybe give them a little scratch behind the ears. Or just stretch out. Because let's be honest, nobody ever conquered a continent without getting comfortable first. If you enjoyed tonight's gentle meander through Mongol history, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe button. Maybe tap the bell if you want more slow history on tap. Feel free to leave a comment. Was it the wild horses or Genghis Khan's lack of permanent architecture that won you over tonight? Or maybe you nodded off ages ago. Honestly, that's the best review. Either way, thanks for being here on Sleepless Historian. Remember, the world has always been a little bit chaotic, but there's something eternal in quiet rhythms and soft stories. So sleep well, stay curious, and let the past wander gently through your dreams. Good night, friends.